So let me get started with a short presentation that will help you get oriented to MedVR. Okay, so welcome to this ongoing series of talks on innovation in medical XR. We've had the good fortune of having many people who have innovated with VR in the many different areas of applications in medicine and healthcare, from mental health to rehabilitation to surgery. Just a couple of comments on MedVR. We're a 501c3 nonprofit educational NGO. We spun out of the MIT Media Lab and the USC XR hackathons. What our charter is to increase the number of people in the medical and technical community that understand innovation in medical XR. It's as challenging a shift as it was for enterprises and institutions to shift from client server and cloud and web to mobile. We want to increase the number of XR prototypes created that continue in development, are incubated, receive grant funding, and later commercial investment every year. Those are two things that we will measure ourselves on, as well as a very, very strong commitment to diversity, both functional diversity, which is what we do, because the teams need to be interdisciplinary, as well as social diversity, who you are. So we believe that that is part of our charter as well. We've been able to do a good job at the MIT Media Lab and at USC to exceed the norms, and we plan to do that here. In 2022, we will begin delivering an interdisciplinary boot camp training in medical and medical and technical professionals to innovate with medical XR to expand that field. That is, it'll be a hybrid approach, both online and in person, and we hope to draw people, hopefully, if the pandemic allows, from all over the world. So we have a very strong group of partners that have been very, very supportive. We're seed funded, we're hiring, and we're raising money to launch the boot camp. The next talk, not to take away from this talk, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, and I will put a link in the chat. We have the FDA talking about their research program for extended reality. They are very, very committed to working with the community and innovators. We have a couple of great people to give the talk. We have Ryan Beams, who is one of the research scientists at the FDA, as well as Walter Greenleaf from Stanford. So that's something to look forward to. So, not to distract from today's talk, this is an exciting talk, which is the future of surgical training. Justin Barad is here with us. You'll hear a little bit more about him in a minute. He is co-founder, CEO of Oso VR, which is a venture-funded, successful surgical training VR company. And we also have Roger Douglas Diaz, MD, PhD, and MBA that I'll give you a little bit more detail about in a second. Roger is a physician scientist focused on the application of technology to enhance clinicians' performance and improve patient safety in a variety of fields, including emergency medicine, critical care, surgery, and space medicine. If you want to know what emergency medicine is going to be like on the long space flights to Mars, he studied the problem. He trained at the internal medicine and emergency medicine at the University of Sao Paulo Medical School in Brazil, and he earned a PhD in medical science and an MBA in hospital and health systems administration from Harvard University. During his postdoctoral Harvard Medical School fellowship, he researched simulation, human factors, non-technical skills, wearable sensors, and machine learning. He is an instructor of emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School and the director of research and innovation at the Stratus Center for Medical Simulation at Brigham and Women's. And just a comment on the Stratus Center, they are musicians. They are absolutely amazing in their creative capability to create believable scenarios in simulation that are believable to medical professionals with extensive experience. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Roger, who will moderate the talk. Roger, it's the microphone's yours.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to moderate this panel. For today's talk, we have the honor to receive Dr. Justin Barad, as Stephen mentioned, the co-founder and CEO of Oso VR. That is an award-winning surgical training platform helping to enhance patient safety and the adoption of medical technologies. What is really interesting and unique, I would say, about Justin is that in addition to leading the Oso VR company, he's also an orthopedic surgeon with an MD and medical residency from UCLA and a clinical fellowship here in Boston at the Boston Children's Hospital. Justin has also earned a bioengineering degree from UC Berkeley, and he has also worked as a game developer. So it's really unique skill set. I had the opportunity to meet with Justin and Stephen a few weeks ago in preparation for this talk, and I'm sure his story and his journey will certainly inspire you, whatever you are a developer, engineer, manager, educator, or clinician passionate about XR and education. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Justin Barad to talk about the future of surgical training. Thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Steve, for having me on. Really excited to speak to you all today. You're way too kind in your introduction. The honor is all mine to be able to speak with you, Roger. And the part I'm the most excited about is our Q&A. I don't think there's enough time in the world for you and I to talk about this topic, but hopefully we'll have enough. So today we'll be talking about, in a brief talk prior to the Q&A, a little bit about, as Roger said, my journey, my background. I'm sure a lot of you listening on are very interested in VR, XR, healthcare innovation. So I hope that my story might be helpful to those of you who are looking to solve problems within healthcare. And then I want to give you a little bit of high level about what Oso VR is, a little bit about the company, the problem that we're addressing in healthcare with virtual reality, some examples of the technology in action, the clinical data behind the technology, and then how we're thinking about utilizing it in the field. I think there are a lot of assumptions about how VR should be used, and I like to talk about kind of how we're thinking about it, and then we'll have a nice little Q&A. So kicking off, as Roger and Steve said, I started out in life as an aspiring video game developer. I have a game credit with Activision on a Quake Engine game, if any of you remember that far back. And what actually got me interested in thinking of healthcare is I had a family member become pretty ill. And I just had this idea in my head one day, is there a way to use software and technology maybe to help people and not just for entertainment? So that's what led me to pursue bioengineering at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. And I had this strong desire to invent or create healthcare technology, but actually I had no idea how to get started. So I was seeking advice from a mentor of mine who told me something that really sticks with me to this day. And I think it's probably the best advice I could give anybody. So if you're listening to anything, I would listen to this. If you want to invent something, you really need to understand the problem you're trying to solve first. And the mentor I was talking to thought that one of the best ways to understand medical problems was to be a doctor. So in retrospect, I may have taken his advice a little too literally. And I went to UCLA for med school and residency. And that's where I really experienced this problem firsthand, which is how we train and assess our healthcare professionals with procedure and surgery. And I was able to combine basically my two life passions of video games and healthcare and co-found Oso VR and act as a CEO during the week. And I still get the opportunity to practice pediatric orthopedic trauma at Orthopedic Institute for Children in UCLA. So with all of that, let's dive right in. So Oso VR is a mission-driven organization. I'd love to share that mission with you all. Our mission is to improve patient outcomes with better education and assessment, increase the adoption of higher value techniques and technologies in surgery like robotics and minimally invasive surgery, and democratize access to surgical education for everyone, everywhere. One of the things that's the most exciting about Oso VR is really the team, and that's what's changing the most rapidly. We're currently 120 employees, which is insane. And I don't have enough time to go over everybody. And I got to say, if anyone suffers from imposter syndrome, working alongside these team members is incredibly humbling. I will say that we've raised $43 million in venture capital financing as the world's largest VR surgical training company. We're backed by Kaiser Permanente Ventures and GSR Ventures, as well as Signalfire. And some key things about the team is, one is we're home to the world's largest medical illustration team. I always say that medical illustrators are the most important profession no one's ever heard of, but medical illustrators are the reason we've had multiple breakthroughs within healthcare, which is, it's often not about the discovery itself, but how we communicate about it. We have about 38 medical illustrators at Oso VR, which is completely massive and very exciting. We also have some pretty incredible people working at the company. Just a couple to point out. One is our VP of product, joined us as from Sony, where he was general manager of all of virtual reality. That's Anu Kirk. We also have our art director, Jonathan Sabella, who joined us from Industrial Light and Magic, the studio behind Star Wars and many Marvel movies. You're going to see his influence here. He also supervised the first team to ever win an Oscar for their work on a VR film. It goes on, but we have people coming from Apple, Industrial Light and Magic, Intel, Electronic Arts, all the top studios coming together to solve a problem in healthcare and utilize the incredible skills they developed over a lifetime. We're also backed by a pretty incredible clinical advisory board. It's headed up by Tom Crummell, the former chair of surgery at Stanford. We also have Dr. Yamaguchi on board, who's the chief medical officer at Centene, and other quite notable and amazing surgeons and physicians and nurses and OR staff, all members of the team. So I want to talk a little bit about the problem we're trying to solve in healthcare today. And so, when it comes to the delivery of procedural and surgical care in healthcare, we have a few dynamics that are becoming worse over time. The first is really it's a good problem to have, in that there's just too much to learn. If you think about it, accelerating science and technology is expanding the library of procedures healthcare professionals are expected to know how to do on demand. In a way, I always say it's like we're going from French Laundry to Cheesecake Factory, right? You can't do everything well. And so I always tell a really fun story just to give an example. One day I was sitting there minding my own business, eating lunch, when I was paged urgently to drive down and take care of a very special patient at the zoo who happened to be a gorilla. And I never knew I was expected to be able to operate on a gorilla. I clearly had never done it before. There was a lot of Googling on the way there, and that all went great. But I tell the story, one, because it's really cool and exciting, but also to highlight that at this point, we're really dealing with gorilla-like situations every day in healthcare. These are procedures maybe we've never done before or only do very rarely, because there's so much that we can pull from. So it's once again, it's a good problem to have that we have all of these options, but it poses some new challenges for us. Another thing is that these newer procedures that are incredibly exciting robotics, minimally invasive techniques, patient-specific surgery, navigation, actually introduce new complexities and have much longer learning curves. And you don't see too many people talking about this, where a traditional open surgery might have a learning curve of maybe 20 cases, whereas a robotic version of that surgery might have a learning curve more on par with 80 to 100 cases. So, really an order of magnitude in terms of the learning curve and the educational burden. The final piece of the puzzle is really almost complete lack of assessment of technical skill in healthcare. And this is not because we don't want to assess technical ability. It's we don't really have a good way to right now. Like they do in aviation, for example, pilots will recertify themselves maybe every 6 months in a simulator to make sure that they're able to do certain critical tasks. And, right now in healthcare, like in our field of orthopedics, which is always a little bit behind other fields, to be fair. But in my career, the only time I've really been assessed, I was literally asked to play the board game Operation and remove a few plastic pieces without buzzing, which I did, and I'm very proud of. But the data shows, and there's a classic paper anyone involved in simulation will quote, and Roger, curious to see your thoughts, from Birkmeyer et al. In New England Journal of Medicine in 2013, that is really one of the first papers to show and prove that surgical proficiency, procedural skill is directly associated with patient outcomes and critical quality metrics. So if we don't know how we're performing, we can't really do anything about the problem. So this is also a critical piece of the puzzle. So being involved in gaming, I was involved in VR very early with the Oculus DK1, which many of you are familiar with. I put on the headset, I tried the Tuscany demo, I hacked it together with the 6 Sense Hydra controllers, and I was like, wow, this is an incredible solution for this problem. You can use it anytime, anywhere, train on any procedure, train as a team, and also coach remotely, and get objective assessment for one of the first times ever. So I want to show you some examples of the technology in action and point out a few key things here. So the first thing is that VR is a very mature technology, as many of you know at this point. The Oculus Quest 2 is an incredible piece of hardware for really ridiculously affordable cost. If you think about it, it's much cheaper than a smartphone. The vast majority of people at this point, especially within healthcare, have tried virtual reality. And many people have tried some sort of version of VR procedural training or surgical training, which is seen as one of the main use cases of virtual reality, which is training and simulation. But when people see or try Oso VR, what they tell us is they go, wow, this is really different from what I've seen before. And part of what they're seeing is they're seeing a level of visual fidelity they're not used to seeing in virtual reality, especially in healthcare. And what we're doing at Oso VR is we're taking the techniques that they use on The Mandalorian, The Last Jedi, Avengers, and we're applying it to surgical training for one of the first times ever. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One is we're training healthcare professionals who have very high educational burdens and needs, and it needs to be clinically accurate. It needs to work. But the second is also, whenever you're asking someone to do something different, especially in healthcare, which is notoriously conservative, you need to give people a reason. You need to encourage them. You need to inspire them. And that's what we're looking to do at Oso VR. We are using the power of art to inspire this generation of healthcare professionals to try something new, to know that better is possible, that this technology can introduce incredible advantages into the technologies and techniques that they're bringing to their patients. And it's also important to note, in addition to the fidelity that you're seeing here, trigger warning, by the way, this is a medical talk, so hopefully you guys were braced for some key anatomy here. We're looking at a shoulder for those of you that aren't super familiar here. This yellow stuff, this is actually an iodine infused plastic wrap we put over the skin to improve the sterility. This is the subcutaneous fat here. This is actually the socket of the shoulder. It's called the glenoid. This is a resected humerus with a little metal cap here, and these are different types of retractors. And so in addition to the level of fidelity, which is very impressive, there are a couple of other key things to point out. One is this is running on standalone VR, which we know is relatively lower processing power than the prior generation of tethered VR. So getting something to look this high fidelity is a huge technical challenge. The other thing is that this is performance. So this is running very smoothly, and that we're also doing this at scale across hundreds of procedures. This is the world's largest VR surgical training library. So the way that Oso VR works is relatively unique in the space, in that we simulate every single step of the procedure end to end and also assess your knowledge of those steps. What I often see in the simulation space is that people are pulling out bits of a procedure and simulating that component, which is, of course, important. We want to understand every little bit of a procedure, be able to do it well. But unless you have the procedure really end to end, it only takes one step to really throw you off. Like I was doing a submuscular plating of a femur fracture the other day, and we forgot to put in a K-wire to fix this plate to the bone. Added 20 minutes to the case because the plate was flying all over the place. We realized our mistake, backtracked, but just that one little tiny step, which is very easy to do. It's not technically difficult, but it's, these surgeries have hundreds and hundreds of steps, and we basically have to have it memorized, a lot like a musician that is performing on the piano or guitar. And so, unless you have it really smoothly memorized, especially when you're doing all of these different procedures now, even the smallest thing can throw you off significantly. In addition to understanding the steps of the procedure, we also have the ability to make mistakes and perform steps well. This is something we call accuracy-based interaction. So this is an example of that in action, where this is an orthopedic procedure for a tibial shaft fracture. I'm putting in a guide wire, which is one of the most important steps of the case. This is going to, hold on, let me optimize for video here. This is going to determine where your implant goes in the bone. And so what I'm getting here is I'm getting feedback on this top screen of, hey, where is the pin entering the bone? What is the angle and what is the depth? And I'm provided the opportunity to fail. I also have simulated fluoroscopy in here, so you can use x-rays without being exposed to radiation. Then you can do fun things in VR that you can't do in real life, like pull the bone out of the body. I guess you could do that in real life, but it would probably scare everybody. This is another example of one of our accuracy-based interactions. So this is that same procedure. Now I'm targeting a hole in the distal part of this titanium rod that's already in the bone. And this is, I think, a really important point, is we often fall in love with the idea of realism and fidelity. We want our simulators and our simulations to be as realistic as possible, which is great. But you don't want to sacrifice educational value and usability for the sake of realism. And so people are often like, hey, can you fail? Can you fail? Can you fail? Yes, you can fail, but you also want to make sure people have the opportunity to succeed. Because if all people are doing are failing, they're not going to be in the zone of optimal learning, and they will get frustrated and stop using your simulation platform. And you could have the best simulator in the world. If people aren't using it, it doesn't actually provide any value. So it's important that these things are engaging and entertaining and usable to the point where you don't want it to be too easy either, but you want that just right sweet spot form of challenge. So we're providing a little bit of guidance here to really bring people in for a landing so they can get things correct and envision success for themselves. Another important aspect of Oso VR is the ability to train collaboratively. So, all of us could jump into VR right now together into a virtual operating room. So I want to show you exactly what this looks like here.
Okay.
With some incredibly hammy acting.
Hey, Leaf, if you could hand me that insertion handle.
So surgery is a team sport. We can have up to 8 people in a single surgery.
Together for you.
Thank you very much.
With these newer procedures, everybody is important. It's not like you're just sitting around at a computer putting in orders. You're now serve a very important role
Awesome.
with these newer minimally invasive surgeries, with robotics and enabling technology.
And if you could be so kind, I left my mallet on that table over there.
Okay, sure.
You got it?
I see it. It's right here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
I'll bring it right back over to you.
Okay.
Sorry.
There you go, sir.
Acting is so corny, I can't get over it. We have the best team. But you can see even moving around in an operating room can often be an important part of the procedure, especially with all of this capital equipment and screens and things you need to move around to different parts of the room. So thinking about how you're going to enable that and make it easier for users is very important. So at this point, it looks amazing. It's the world's largest library, runs on standalone VR. But at the end of the day, what do we care about? This needs to work, right? We're taking care of patients. This is often very high risk procedures. So we want to make sure that's actually effective. So what does the data show? So this is a study that was performed independently at UCLA, where they were comparing 10 trainees trained and assessed in Oso VR to 10 trainees trained traditionally. So this is a lecture, this is a technique guide, list of steps, illustrations. So what you're going to see here, if you focus on the individual on the right, is he's running through, this is once again that orthopedic procedure. This is called a tibial nail. And this is on a physical model, as you can see here. It's running through relatively smoothly. It's going to get a little handshake. Nice work, buddy. And if you look on the left side here, you'll notice there's a little piece of paper here that this trainee keeps coming back to check. That's actually a list of steps. It's like a cheat sheet you can check if you don't remember what to do next. And what's interesting is this guy checks this 26 times, while the Oso VR trained and assessed individual checks that piece of paper 0 times. So to me, what really is the take-home point from this video that is such a strong message to me, that the guy on the left was given as much time as he needed to prepare and only came into the test environment when he felt ready. He felt confident. He's like, I can do this. I'm going to nail this nail, pun intended. On the right side, this person was objectively measured to be ready. He had some sort of technology tell him when he was okay to proceed. And so what this tells me is how we feel and what reality is often are incredibly different. And the thing to note is that in healthcare today, the vast majority of surgical and procedural care delivery is based on this intuitive assessment. Someone is making a judgment call either for themselves or someone else that they're ready to do these procedures rather than some sort of objective standard. So there's a lot of exciting room for improvement is the good news there. So in this study that was published in the Journal of Surgical Education in early 2020, they found that the performance scores as measured by something called the Global Rating Scale, or GRS, was 230% higher in the Oso VR trained and assessed individuals. In an additional study, this was performed at University of Illinois, Chicago. This looked at the ability to perform a procedure without needing supervision, without needing someone to step in, which is ultimately really what you want before you practice independently. What they found is that in a traditionally trained cohort, 25% of that group could complete a procedure without requiring someone to step in. When using Oso VR for training and assessment, that went up to 78%. This was published in a top 3 orthopedic journal. This is a unpublished data currently under review, but this is for arthroplasty, so slightly different specialty within orthopedics. This also found that the performance score went up by 6 points, similar order of magnitude. Procedure time improved by 10 minutes. Redirections went down by about 60%, and training time was also more efficient. This idea of what's called the transfer efficiency ratio, that VR is a more efficient training modality than reading a book or watching a video. The number one question we get is about haptic feedback. As many of you are familiar, we utilize the Oculus Quest and Quest 2 controllers, which incorporate cutaneous haptics, but we do not use what's called grounded kinesthetic haptics, or traditionally what people think of as force feedback. So what's really exciting is we actually have a study that's currently under review directly comparing training in Oso VR with standalone VR with a fully hands-on physical model with force feedback. And what they found is there was no difference in skill transfer between a fully force feedback training modality and training in Oso VR. So this is very interesting. This is a whole other talk altogether, and I could talk for days about a lot of the pitfalls and how we think about simulation and how we think about grounded kinesthetic versus ungrounded kinesthetic, force feedback versus cutaneous haptics. Another important component, once again, if people don't find simulation engaging or entertaining or easy to use, they won't use it. And so this is a study performed at Wake Forest where 100% of the residents found it effective. They also found it enjoyable and easy to use. And then finally, this is a motion analysis study performed at Wake Forest where they put motion trackers on individuals performing an actual procedure and then also training on the same procedure in Oso VR. So what we're able to do is superimpose these two motion data sets. And you can see for yourself that what you're doing in virtual reality is pretty indistinguishable from what you're doing in real life, which is, I think, really exciting. So I want to wrap up my talk talking about how we're thinking about utilizing this technology in healthcare. Whenever I show anyone Oso VR, talk about Oso VR, or see anyone talk about simulation, they immediately go to, they ask themselves the question, can this replace in-person training? Can this replace operating on patients? Can this replace cadaver labs? And my answer is, in some cases, yes, but by and large, no. And that's not the intent. In-person training is incredibly valuable. Training on a cadaver, training on a patient, ideally you're not training on a patient, but it's the world we live in. I mean, that is going to be the highest fidelity experience for sure. But doing that as your very first repetition is incredibly inefficient. And adult learning tells us we're going to lose 90% of what we learned within a week and 50% within an hour, to be honest. So a traditional education journey right now, an important part of the process for us as healthcare professionals is the idea of what I call technique or technology discovery. We need to first understand what's out there to see if we even want to learn about it to use with our patients. So this is often at in-person conferences, which is kind of a challenge right now. I just got back from a very big orthopedic conference, which had much lower attendance than typical. Then we're often going on to a hands-on training lab, maybe to get 1 or 2 repetitions. And then a few months later, we're doing our first case. What this means is that, this case often is not going very well. And if we're going to stick with it, if we're going to see this through all the way to proficiency, we're basically practicing on a patient for the majority of our learning curve. So that means many, many patients that are not seeing the same kind of outcomes that they would see with a fully proficient practitioner or team. So this is the idea of a VR-enabled educational journey where you can easily perform technique discovery from the comfort of your own home, find out what's out there. And then prior to a hands-on lab, you can train and assess yourself in VR, get the vast majority of your training and learning curve in VR. And then the idea of the hands-on training is that this is what I call last mile training. You are refining your knowledge. It's the cherry on top. It's the final exam. You're getting those little bits and pieces that you're not getting from VR because it's not 100% realistic. It is very close. But now this is a much better utilized time and travel and cost. And then if you do have any gaps prior to that hands-on training lab and actually operating on a patient, you have an incredible refresh tool. You can train the team so that you're really minimizing the risk that patients are exposed to because you are basically almost fully proficient by the time you're operating on your first patient. I've talked a lot about objective analytics. Excuse me. What does that actually look like? So this is an example of our analytics. You can see these red triangles are steps you didn't remember or steps you didn't perform well, and also your efficiency versus a recommended goal time, as well as a achievement-based or milestone-based proficiency system. We're never telling someone, hey, you're a 50% surgeon, you're a 60% surgeon, you're a 20% surgeon. It's more like, hey, here are the steps we all need to go through to achieve proficiency. And it's less about kind of saying who's good and who's bad. We're also available in any language. So this is an example of our localization in action. So there's a lot to cover. Hopefully that was a good overview for you all, but I'm incredibly honored and excited to be a part of this program and be talking to a bunch of current and future innovators, both in healthcare and the XR space. So thank you so much for having me on. Very excited to dig in and see what kind of interesting questions we have here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Justin. It was really great to see this 30 minutes overview of your journey and where you are right now. We have a few questions here, and I've also prepared a few questions to stimulate our discussion. And I see that most of the questions we had are related to the ones I prepared here. So I'm trying to merge them. I'm going to start first with the entrepreneurship side, right? So think about, we can take many angles here, right? We can manage the angles of the medical education and training, the angle of technology development. So let's start with the entrepreneurship and innovation side. And at the beginning, you mentioned something very interesting, right? That you learned from a mentor that was about really to, at least at the beginning, right? Avoiding jumping directly to developing new technology, new solutions, and spending some energy and time and effort on understanding the problem, right? And that's, I think, it's a great message I've seen across many different type of industries and innovative approach and entrepreneurship. We usually say, right, be passionate about the problem more than about your solution, because sometimes your solution is not the best solution for that, to solve that problem, right? But it's a very, so I think everyone gets that, right? But it's a very, at least to me at the beginning, it was very difficult, right? Because once we like something like a technology, let's say XR or AI, we really love that, and we try to find problems to solve with the things we love, right? And I'm curious, and I'm sure everyone can learn from you, how was that balance and sometimes that threshold for you of stepping back from developing technology and testing that, but spending some time and effort trying to understand the problem, the unmet, and the needs for your customers, for example?
Yeah, I think, I don't have a great answer for that. I think that is a very big challenge. I think probably the group that's done the most to sort of systematize some of this thinking within healthcare would be the biodesign program out of Stanford, which is sort of spreading now. They have biodesigns at UCLA and at Texas Medical Center. But the biodesign textbook is a great place to start. I would describe it that, I see sort of two spheres that I pull from. One is the problems that I'm experiencing, and then the technologies that I'm passionate about. And it almost just kind of organically happened where this is a problem that I was encountering, and then there was a technology that I was interested in, and they both lined up with each other in that, this was the best solution for the problem. And the problem was also needs to be really one that, I often see this from healthcare professionals where they can fall in love with the problem too, but the problem can actually be pretty not a good business, right? It's like it's something that they personally care about, but it's not really scalable as well. So you need to think about these components, but they just sort of organically will kind of meet in the middle, and you'll come up with a really good solution that's scalable. I think when you fall in love with one or the other, I think that's where you start to run into some challenges where you're trying to maybe force something where there might not be something really there. But that's kind of the art form. And I mean, I've been down the other road too. All sorts of odd ideas that, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that wasn't going to go anywhere, even though I was really excited about it.
Sounds great. So we have here the first question related to that from Zuhai. Hi, Dr. Barad. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm a maker and a medical student, second year at UVA School of Medicine with background in biomedical engineering and venture creation. That's great. So his first question related to that is like, what did you initially pitch before large funds came in? Needed to prototype in 3D versus storyboard? Did you bootstrap? So what about your the early stage of Oso VR?
Yeah, I think so. Initially, I built the first version myself in Unity. I was fortunate to have a background in game development. And then I was kind of just trolling the Oculus forums. And, I met my co-founder on the internet. And I had some money saved up from my bar mitzvah that I used to pay him as a contractor. This is all true. And, timing is, better lucky than good, and I think, timing has worked out for us in a lot of ways throughout the life of the company. But at the time, as some of you may remember, VR was like, what NFTs were a few months ago, right? It was very exciting. And if you basically had VR in your company name, investors were going to be interested. And so we had entered the GPU Technology Conference, or GTC, and won an award. And that got a lot of attention. And it just immediately, with very little effort, we were getting very, very small offers for funding, but some funding came in at that point. And that's where we really kind of we both were able to go full time with the company. And then things just sort of evolved naturally from there. It was a very experimental time. I don't think we used those funds super wisely because we didn't really know what we were doing. But built the first version myself, kind of invested a little bit myself to get it off the ground, but then really lucked out in terms of just kind of the timing of the environment. I think also the story of the company was very helpful in the early days. You don't have a lot to go off of. We had a compelling product demo, which was really great. But I think, you have a professional game developer. My co-founder came from electronic arts, and then a sort of amateur game developer turned practicing surgeon, made for a very compelling story. And storytelling is a really big part of making these things successful, especially in the early days where you don't have a lot to go off of. So if you're trying to get people to join your team, if you're trying to raise funding, if you're trying to create partnership or sales, you really have to tell a very compelling story and be engaging and exciting for people. Because, it's, when you think about it, for someone to quit like a really stable, secure career to, join a couple of guys who are like, just doing this in their garage, it's kind of a wild thing. So you have to have a pretty compelling reason for people to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And before we go, we have a lot of technical questions as well about the technology, of course, and everything. But before going that, because I see this many times, right? And I see that many people, many companies have access to the same technology that you have, right? So what is the difference? And let's talk a little about, okay, you got investment, right? And there are many factors, as you mentioned. There's the timing, there is the hype of VR, AI, and stuff, and of course the team that you put together and convince like investors. And what about clients now, right? Because you're like in the medical education healthcare industry, and as you know, right, people are very resistant to change in medical education. And it's interesting because this week I gave 2 talks, one in Saudi Arabia and one in China, with like hospital and medical education, medical simulation, right? And when talk about XR in general, all of them were like have experience with vendors and trying to implement XR based education in their medical training. And the question is always about value, right? How can you show value and return on investment? And I'm sure you have thought about that and you're trying to tackle that. And you show some of the evidence, right, that for like showing value and return on investment, even convincing like the healthcare industry, at the end, buyers will be like teachers, professors, and students and hospitals. So they also are very scientific based. So, but talk a little more about how you show value and return on investment for your clients.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is an important part of any medical innovation or innovation in general. And I think education in particular can be a challenging area because you can have something that works 200% better, 300% better, but, you know, it feels abstract to people. And, you know, it's like, and what does that get them exactly? You know, like if I'm 200% better at the end of residency than I was when I started, does that change anything for my residency program? Like how incentivized are they to really invest in that? I think, you know, at the end of the day, it depends where you are, but certainly in the US, especially, that understanding kind of the cost of healthcare and understanding how the business runs and how revenue is generated is really important. And, you know, if you can somehow save a significant amount of cost or even better, generate more revenue and ideally 10x so, then, you know, you can create a perpetual motion machine of a business model, which is how technology gets distributed. It needs to be driven by something, and there needs to be a very strong incentive as well. You can have a pretty strong ROI, but sometimes a value proposition can be a nice to have, and you need to find pain points that are a need to have. You know, and a lot of our early work was in the medical device industry, where we found basically what was close to an existential crisis. And we don't have enough time to get into all the dynamics, but, you know, very early on, like, there was, you know, the past number of decades, simulators were selling to hospital systems and residency programs, but, you know, their funding is rather limited. And also, like, you know, if you have a simulator at a hospital, you know, and you're very familiar with this, Roger, it's like, you know, at the end of the day, how is that going to really change their business? And everyone loves having simulation centers and simulation programs, and you can create kind of a business about it, but it's not like a game changer, right? And there's no immediate threat that it's addressing. So, you know, looking outside of traditional business models within simulation, I think, is how we got a lot of our early success. So really trying to understand, like, and then focus. Like, I think a lot of these newer technologies, AI, what we're doing in VR, AR, can be applied almost anywhere. And if you try and do everything at once, you will never scale, because you are going to have 1,000 projects all jumbled together. And what you need to have is some kind of scalable platform. You need a repeatable solution. And this is where working with hospitals and healthcare providers almost immediately breaks everything, because everyone has very specific and custom needs. And, you know, especially working with very busy healthcare professionals like surgeons, maybe we don't have the perspective of understanding kind of the implications of technology development and how customization is, you know, how to balance that with scalability. And so we can have these very intense demands of these vendors, as you say, that can be very derailing and basically cause these companies to fail almost immediately. So I think one is that working with hospitals and healthcare professionals, I wrote an article on TechCrunch like this, is kind of set up for challenges almost off the get-go. And it is extremely hard at the early stage to work with these groups. And another thing is that if you are coming in without, once again, a deep understanding of the problem space, it is going to be very hard to have a point of view. So that if you have imagine a famous doctor is like, hey, you really need to implement this one thing because that's the most important thing. We're like, wow, guy's like a famous surgeon. I should listen to him. And then another famous doctor is like, oh, well, you also need to implement this thing and then this thing. And so now you have like all of these competing priorities that sound really important. And so are you going to do all of it? Are you going to do none of it? How are you going to prioritize this if you don't have some kind of key point of view or like a level of expertise of your own? And so that's where I see things become very difficult with, people coming from outside healthcare into the system, is that they're listening to these people who they think are key advisors, often without as much training in professional software development or technology backgrounds, which is incredibly unintuitive. And we're seeing sort of a disconnect between the more technology there is, the more people think they understand how it's made. And so and also the higher their expectations. So it is increasingly difficult to partner on technology development because of these kind of assumptions, unintuitive expectation settings and things like that. So working with hospitals and healthcare professionals is very, very hard, even for me. And it's nobody's fault. It's just kind of like the system and how it's set up. But, when people are like, hey, we're trying to do these projects with these hospitals and things like that, they aren't thinking about helping you develop a scalable solution that you can scale over the world. They're like, I have these patients and I need to help them. And this is what I need to do that. And it's like balancing that with your needs as a company or a vendor or a startup is extremely challenging if I didn't get that across.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's exactly like the reason for the questions, really to realize that any type of like medical technology and healthcare, there are some unique features and peculiarities that are really different from other industries, and how to navigate that. I'm sure you learn a lot from that. And on that area, for example, one of the assumptions, right, that you mentioned is that, about the customer segments, right? Someone may think, okay, what are the best customer segments to do XR-based training, like medical students, residents, and stuff, right? But then when you go there, right, I see, for example, that you found partnership with medical device companies, right, and specialty associations, right? So how was navigating like the customer segment, and maybe even focus more on B2B than a B2C model, direct to students, but trying to sell and get the buy-in from the institutions, and not only traditional institutions like hospitals and medical schools, like nursing schools, but also medical device companies and associations?
Yeah, once again, I think it just comes from, really trying to understand the different segments and the verticals. I think we were very lucky in the early days that I've been in medical school, in residency, and I was involved in the purchase of educational technologies and familiar with how this all worked, and just kind of understanding, what those market sizes are, how that sales process will go, what the ROI is for the different players, if any at all, what their incentives are. And I think it's, where you think these technologies, you really need to put your assumptions aside, I guess I should say, and really just try and look at what the data is showing you. And I think, and then you need to try things out. Like, you don't know anything for sure. Like, if you're truly doing something disruptive or innovative, most of the things you're doing, no one's ever done before. So you have to try some things out and see where you're getting traction, and then lean into those areas. But people often are like, oh, you should be used in medical schools, but it's like, but what will that get a medical school, right? And medical schools facing all sorts of problems right now in terms of just what is even the point anymore, because the disconnect between what we actually do as clinicians and what we learn in medical school are like pretty far apart. So it's complicated, and I think it's some of the things that spaces that seem like, it's like, oh, it's training, it's simple to understand. can often be the most complicated because it's just sort of easy to sort of understand the early bits, but very, very difficult to master. As you know, being so deeply involved in it, it's like training and assessment in healthcare is an incredibly complex problem set with a lot of different spheres and verticals and stakeholders.
Yep, no, that's great. So before we jump to the technical questions, I have one very interesting question about, can you explain a little about like potential resistance from clinicians, right? So the question, the comment is, I see two problems in broad application of technology medicine. One is the distrust in machines, in particular in AI, and the potential for people to challenge the use of them legally, sort of a right not to be operated on by a machine or with machine collaboration, let's say. The other is in the distrust of the surgeon trained with the use of technology for similar reasons, seeing as this type of learning as not real. Have you considered these issues and how do you propose to solve them?
Well, once again, I mean, there's no simple answer to this question. You know, I say that that what was laid out there is both true and not true, just depending on kind of the situation. So, you know, most patients at this point, my feeling is that they want robotics. They want some sort of technology, making sure that what they do, you know, the surgeons operating on them aren't just winging it. And so there's a huge demand for robotic surgery right now. This is why you're seeing a lot of it. I think most surgeons at this point, I think see, you know, we'll see the benefit of, you know, having something check what they do. Their concerns are, I don't want to be slowed down. And there is a trust concern that, you know, if I'm looking at a screen, if the screen's telling me that I'm safe, but I feel like I'm pointing towards the spinal cord, how do I reconcile this now? And that's a difficult situation. And you know, there's concern as surgery gets further automated that, you know, there's less control over these inaccuracies. So that's totally fair. I think with the training thing, I think goes back to my talk, is that you just need to position this, what this is and what this isn't. This isn't replacing anything that we currently do. It's adding to it. Because there's a huge, like, you know, do you want your surgeon coming in having, like, I mean, right now I'll do surgery. I just print something out from the internet and I'll tape it on the wall and then I'll go to town. Send all your kids to me. And so, I mean, that's kind of what we have right now. And so now, instead of that, would you rather have someone who trained, you know, 100 times in a simulator on a VR headset? And then, you know, even if you make the argument it wasn't 100% realistic, would you say that that's better than the tape up on the wall situation, right? Because nothing is being taken away. This is only adding educational value. So that's kind of the idea of, like, I think it's much less scary when you're like, hey, this isn't replacing anything that we're already doing. It's just providing a lot more repetitions and introducing a lot more checkpoints and objective assessment that previously that there's none of, you know, and it's like, you know, just ask any patient, like, hey, would you rather have a surgeon operate on you with, you know, they saw a video and there was no assessment and then they came into the room, or that they trained in the simulator 50 times and had some kind of assessment? And maybe it's not 100% realistic, but, you know, which of those two situations would you want? And then, of course, ideally with the in-person component as well as, like, the kind of the final exam.
Yeah. And the other thing I would add is really that, like, the realization that I would say that most people are not aware, right? That medical errors and serious adverse events due to human error, right? And preventable human error is a pandemic, right? And it's estimated to be like the third leading cause of death in the United States. And even if it's not the third, I'm sure it's like between the 10. And that can be overcome by training, better training. And that's really like about the value proposition, right, of like your company, your technology, and your solution really focus on patient safety, right, and empowering healthcare professionals to provide better care to patients and safer care to patients. So I think that's really, really important. And if the technology, and I agree that the technology is going to be like the facilitator, right, for us to be able to provide better care to patients, that's really great. And it's not, as I mentioned, replacing current methodologies or like current solutions, but say adds on. So it's really important. So going to the more technical one, I have someone saying, oh, interactive simulation has many benefits. I'm wondering if you also see a place for 3D VR video in surgical training. If so, what challenges or limitations currently hinder this approach?
They're kind of two, not sure if that's referring to 360 video, which is, seeing some success in kind of the remote proctoring space, which I see as sort of a related kind of way of addressing what we are, but a little bit different, of more observational. And then there's kind of photogrammetry based recordings of surgery, which are more interactive than the 360 video. I think, there are a couple of companies I'm close with in that space. I don't know too much about it from a data standpoint or, the exact utility of that technology quite yet. I think that's an exciting early space, but certainly some amazing stuff going on in sort of the videogrammetry realm. And the other thing I'll say is that, like you talk about medical errors being a big concern. Certainly there are quite a few. I do want to point out that, the procedures that we have access to are nothing short of miraculous. And I think, just speaking to a group of what I believe to be healthcare innovators, I think it's been a rather negative couple of years and difficult as a healthcare professional, just for all sorts of hopefully obvious reasons. And I just want to call out that as you guys are presenting your solutions to these, what are problems, what are challenges, what are gaps, that we also acknowledge how amazing both the technologies and treatments that we have access to are, and the people that deliver them. Our healthcare professionals are nothing short of heroes, especially today, working under unbelievable circumstances. And the conditions that we can treat today are unbelievable, that you wouldn't think possible just a few years back. We're so lucky to have these treatments. Better is possible, in the words of Atul Gawande, certainly, like you say, Roger. And I think in addition to improving our delivery of the procedures themselves, my major concern is that there are procedures and technologies out there that we're not even attempting to deliver because of this challenge around technique discovery and then proficiency. That robotics, navigation, patient-specific techniques, minimally invasive techniques, they're not being utilized because of the training burden. So it's not even that we're not doing it well or they're not causing errors, that these procedures that are better for all of us are not being delivered to patients because of the training burden. And we need to bridge that gap so that we have access to the best possible procedures. And that's really what I'm excited about, because these technologies are unbelievable. And if I ever needed surgery, I would want them. But surgeons are not adopting them at the rate that you would hope, because the educational burden is much larger than procedures of the past, and it's difficult today to get access to education.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, especially like in surgery, right? I can give you the example. I'm originally from Brazil, right? My brother is a orthopedic surgeon, and every time they have yeah, I know, but every time they have, let's say, a new medical device in orthopedics, right? For training, what they do, they fly all the doctors from Brazil and other countries to the United States. As you know, that there is a training center. They even bring the teacher, the faculty, who are going to speak with them like their language. And so you can imagine like the cost, right? And the lack of access for many other countries, many other cities in the same country that don't have access to that training, right? And I think with virtual reality, you really make that possible, right? Because you basically remove this geographic, spatial, and travel barrier, and it's really, really great.
Well, I hope to meet your brother in VR someday soon.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of questions about the haptic, right? And you mentioned that, and it's very interesting, because I remember even now when you talk to surgeons, right? And then they have that understand about VR. And then the first thing is, without even trying, right, is like, oh, VR will not be useful for surgery because you don't have haptic feedback, right? And you show like those very interesting data. I'd like you to talk a little more about that in terms of like the technical aspect and how your product provides haptic feedback, or what is different from the others.
Yeah, I think, well, this is the number one question we get, and I think everyone's brains really go immediately to this. Once again, this is not designed to replace in-person training. And so the key problem that we're solving is one of accessibility, not necessarily tactile fidelity. And so you could have the best simulator in the world that is 100% realistic, but if it's in a lab that's in a basement that's 20 miles away, it's not going to get utilized. But if you have a $300 headset that you can bring wherever you are and use in between surgeries at home, you're going to get a lot more educational value out of that, even if you make an argument that it's lower fidelity or less realistic, right? So accessibility is by far more important than overall fidelity, I would say, because you're getting a lot more educational units out of it. But in terms of the question of grounded kinesthetic haptic feedback, this is a really interesting area of research. That this technology has been around for decades, and there's a lot of research on it, especially from the laparoscopic literature. And so you can actually compare a grounded kinesthetic haptic simulator to one with no haptics at all. The vast majority of studies find no difference in terms of skill transfer, whether you have force feedback or none at all. A small number of studies do show a benefit, but it's clinically insignificant. So it's so small, it's not worth the cost and the size and the maintenance that breaks very frequently. And then there's a small number of studies that shows a negative training effect. You're telling people this is 100% realistic. Well, if it's not, you're training them incorrectly, and that can cause some issues down the road. Now, do people even like this form of haptics? What I see, the reason why this cycle keeps going is people who are not surgeons develop these technologies or look at them, invest in them. They're like, wow, this feels so cool. And then you show it to a surgeon, they're like, this feels actually really weird. Mm-hmm. And because you fall into the uncanny valley. And so there's a study called Perceiving Haptic Feedback, where they took a group of 20 surgeons. They asked them what they think the most important feature of a simulator is. 17 out of 20 said haptic feedback, kinesthetic force feedback. Then they had them try a simulator with kinesthetic force feedback and one with none at all. 18 out of 20 preferred the zero haptic simulator, said it felt more realistic, that they performed better. And you see this reflected in robotic surgery, right? I had the assumption that Intuitive's Da Vinci robot had top of the line haptics. How could you possibly remove a prostate or a heart valve with anything less? When I went to use it, I'm like, wow, the haptics feel amazing on this. And the rep told me, oh, it has no haptic feedback. I'm surprised you didn't know that. What I came to learn is that the number one requested feature of the robot was haptic feedback. And they tried 100 different iterations of different forms of kinesthetic force feedback. And everyone hated every single one. And then they showed them one with none at all. And that was everyone's favorite. And so there are a lot of assumptions we make around how force feedback works, how our brain interprets haptics. And it's like the actual contribution that this modality has to skill transfer and education. But I think we really need to rethink a lot of these. And if you look at the robotic and the simulation literature, there's a lot of rethinking going on, and an emphasis on cutaneous haptics, which is what we utilize with Oculus touch controllers, and also a newer field of haptics called skin stretch, which is newer and really interesting and starting to show some really positive results, but is nowhere near really commercialized at this point.
Yeah, that's really great. And that's a great example of what we started discussing, right? It's really like being passionate about your problem and understanding your problem, because sometimes you spend a lot of effort investment on a solution that one wants, right? And you can really see this like in the research world, right? Let's say someone said to you that haptics is very important, and you spend your PhD develop a haptic system, but you didn't listen to the users, right? And what they need, what they prefer. And that's a great example, I think, for everyone here. Is really, of course, like the technology and everything you develop will be the driver or everything of change, but investing time and effort on understanding the problem, the user, it's extremely important, right? And it's really great. And now I have another question here. I have a few more minutes. We're gonna end at 1:15, that are very interesting. That's really, I think we have 3 people ask the same thing. How about, and if you have thought about that, moving from VR to AR, in the sense that you can use your technology and some of the things you're developing for real patient care, right? For like cognitive aid, as a decision clinical support in the real setting.
I think, virtual reality and augmented reality, I think, are very different technologies. I think it's been a little problematic that they've been kind of like lumped together, and AR is like been sort of positioned as like the evolution of VR. Obviously it gets very complicated now that you have pass-through VR and augmented virtual reality and all that. But I'll say that, virtual reality is an ideal training tool. I mean, the data shows that you learn the fastest when you recreate the exact environment that you're going to be training in. And VR is the only really solution that can do that. Also, you know, in terms of hand tracking, cost, performance, there are all sorts of reasons why VR makes the most sense for training and why it is the #1 use case. Now, augmented reality has a lot of potential and already exciting use cases within healthcare. And this is if you're in the context of patient care. So like you're in the operating room, you're taking care of patients, like navigation, visualization, remote proctoring, and learning. So these are areas where augmented reality is incredibly useful. From a training aspect, I don't think it makes as much sense because, you know, why, if anything, you want to be able to train from everywhere, anywhere. So you don't want to use your environment in kind of like a training sort of kind of session. So I think we'll probably be kind of purely in the VR space, but certainly there are AR technologies that we're going to sort of like interact with, or will be on the continuum of care that, you know, you'll probably be using some sort of augmented reality technology for navigation or guidance or remote proctoring or mentoring when you're performing. But when you're training, I think VR makes the most sense.
So that makes a lot of sense. The other, just like a final question before we finish this talk, because you mentioned a lot and show actually like assessments, right? And that's the real challenge we have in medical education. You mentioned the Berkmeyer paper, right, showing that like technical skills correlated with patient outcomes in the real setting. And one of the things that those assessments were like human-based assessments, right? So experts watching videos and doing annotation, basically rating the surgical skills using the OSAT tool, right? And that is very interesting because it brings to us evidence that psychomotor skills is correlated with patient outcomes, but also brings the challenge of scalability, right? How to get all those experts to assess all the surgeons in the world. But now in your system, you bring some automated measures, automated markers of psychomotor skills and cognitive skills. So it would be great to hear more about that and how you see the assessment piece of your system being used and liked by users.
Yeah, I think this is, there are platforms that are attempting to automate some of what you described, like CSATs is an example of that was acquired by Johnson & Johnson. I think, what we're trying to do, and I think actually as a trend, if you look at some of the sort of educational and professional societies is, can we use simple metrics to collect that are correlated with performance that are less labor intensive? So, in the simulation literature, like time is sort of the tried and true, and I think has been validated several, but we do several forms of assessment that is easy for us to collect, but the data clearly shows that I showed to you today that it is directly tied to performance. So while Berkmeyer et al. Did choose a very specific way to do the assessment, potentially doing some of these other forms of assessment that are much more scalable may have seen some similar results as well. And so we are one of the surgeons that we trained actually, and this is kind of an exception, not the rule, trained only in Oso, but a surgeon that did 90 sessions over a 2-week period, was able to take his surgical time on real patients down from 3 hours and 30 minutes, 1 hour and 45 minutes. And that's with our form of scalable assessment. So we're starting to get more and more data that the way that we do this assessment works, but it is certainly much more scalable and easy to do than what is initially laid out in Berkmeyer, which is probably, ideally what you do for everybody, but it's just not feasible.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Justin. And we're going to now turn over to Stephen again, so we can adjourn the session.
Well, firstly, I want to thank both Justin and Roger for sharing their knowledge and experience. This is what is so important in any part of innovation, but even more important in healthcare is knowing the expert and building what's useful, and at the same time building what is scalable. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We can answer further questions. I left the Slack channel link on the chat and the next talk as well. So feel free to interact with us. And it was a fabulous talk that had many aha moments for me. And I've been working on this for a couple of years now. And I think this is my most aha moments in an hour. I think for sure. And don't forget the next talk. This will be up on our website as a video in about a week, and feel free to share it. And thank you all for coming. Thank our speakers.